Welcome to the Same Table Aftershow.
Aftershow.
We are here, but we are down a brother.
We are down a brother.
Usually we are accompanied with, or by, with? No, with. We're accompanied with, I don't even know if that's the right saying. Anyway, usually Sam's with us.
Yes.
But he is, he's not feeling good, so during the recording. So we are without Sam. We are without our token white brother. And so we might be missing a perspective. However, we are still going to recap an episode that you would have recently heard, if not just heard, with our Indigenous guest, Ji-gaabiikwe. Did I say her name right?
Ji-gaabiikwe, yeah.
Ji-gaabiikwe. Sorry, Ji-gaabiikwe, if I always practice, but sometimes I have to work on my pronunciation. But Ji-gaabiikwe and Matt, we had a very interesting, challenging, compelling, thought-provoking,
but like very
interview.
honest.
Yes, very honest.
Deep. Like they went really, they just shared so generously of their stories too. And I'm really grateful to have heard that. Yeah.
And similar stories in terms of some of the things that they would have had to navigate, but also unique for both of them. So I thought that was very refreshing.
Yeah.
And so Deb, what was your kind of biggest takeaway from the conversation?
Well, I think it's probably helpful to mention that when Indigenous emergence came, like they came kind of representing Indigenous emergence, and they also led some of the church through the blanket exercise and spent time actually sharing stories and sharing wisdom and passing on a lot of really. I mean, for me, it was incredibly impactful to go through that whole practice and learn a lot of things from a very Indigenous perspective, and to hear the story and the history of Canada told from an Indigenous perspective. And so to me, their presence on our podcast also represented like a presence of a couple of days having just sharing space with them, learning from them. I also had them over at my house for dinner, and just being able to casually get to know them in a more casual setting. And I felt so blessed. And I think it's a different level of proximity and relationship that they were willing to allow me to step into. So I feel incredibly honored. And I think I remember talking to Ji-gaabiikwe kind of in between a lot of different things and asking her questions about her story, and her just being really honest and open, sharing her journey. And there were some things that I was like, oh man, I've gone through some of those things in a very different way, obviously. But, she had lots of involvement in large, Christian organizations, and had really had to wrestle through some hard things. And, I had a similar and very different experience too. So I was just grateful that she was willing to share some insight into that. So the conversation for me, I really appreciated how deep and how vulnerable that they invited their story. And I really felt honored to receive their stories. And I think at the same time, there were lots of things in it that they talked about that I personally felt challenging for myself, because it invited me to ask myself questions and invited me to actually ask the why do I do things this way? Like, why is my faith shaped that way? Or curiosities into the things that did help shape my faith. And Matt Leblanc gave her a huge challenge that was needed, where he was talking about affirmation, like always looking for, why do we need affirmation? And then why, I think in their experience, just sharing very honestly why they've always been put in a situation where they need to affirm someone else's beliefs or thoughts. And I was just like, oh man, so super challenging, and left me with way more questions than I had answers for. And I think maybe we'll talk about some of those things and have no answers. But what about you, Matthew?
I would concur with you about the opportunity just to fellowship with them, and got to spend some time with them as well, recording the podcast. And then of course we had lunch together just to connect and fellowship. And even I would agree, Matt in particular has a way of challenging people to examine their presuppositions for like everything. I'm saying things, we're talking about like the church and everything, and he would gently ask me to where did you get that idea from? And so it was just very interesting. So many times when I'm having conversations, there is not everyone is honest enough to just say where their point, not even point of contention, but where they're willing to just to challenge and to ask questions. Yeah. But then also in my dialogue with Matt, and this is all offline. I'll get to like the podcast itself, but it's very connected too. But then there's also the element where it's called his gentle questioning about how do I frame certain theologies or beliefs from, definitely made me start to think about that. Yeah, because a lot of times I'm thinking this is assumed across the board, cross culturally, and it's not always. Yeah,
or sometimes even I don't know. I know this for me, like especially if we're chatting with people maybe with different cultural influences or whatever, I'll just stick with like the things that we all agree on, and then you're like, oh wait, maybe we see this very differently. You're like, exactly. I feel a little bit of like that's shaky.
Yeah, for sure. And going into the conversation, I was very curious about some of the parallels between the Indigenous community and the African Nova Scotian community in particular. And I would even go more broader than that in terms of people of African descent, those who have the history of the transatlantic slave trade, who've come here via that. But my curiosity was just the parallels between that injustice and Black people's interaction with Christianity, and then the Indigenous story, and their interaction with Christianity, and also the common theme of how Christianity was twisted and used as a means of oppression to colonize or to enslave or justify those institutions and to oppress those groups of people. So I was really curious to see how there was similarities, differences, but also I know, again, and I brought this up in the conversation, there is sometimes within the Indigenous and Black community a real tension between even being Black and Christian or Indigenous and Christian. Like there's a dichotomy between those things, and I've experienced that, felt that in my own journey. Know lots of people who still wrestle that, even to the point to explicitly say, I have one mentor who will say he is unashamedly Black and unapologetically Christian, which is interesting to even have to say that, right? And so I was just really curious, what does that look like? How does that reconcile within an Indigenous context? Yeah. And so going in with that curiosity and being able to just dialogue a little bit about it, I was very curious, especially what Matt had to say, just seeing some of those similarities, but also differences, and also just really interested in, again, there's this, we were talking about this offline, there's this idea that is anytime Christianity embraces cultural incorporations or norms or practices, there's this term of syncretism that is often levied. And so I was curious of how Matt unpacked that. And I loved his answer that he would say that he's willing to have that conversation, but those levying it against him, are you willing to have it about maybe blind spots of how what you deem to be normalized Christianity is actually riddled with cultural influences that have been normalized to be,
like you accusing
it to be the canon of Christianity,
or like accusing syncretism because you're also syncretist.
I mean,
so it's like,
is not everyone, I guess.
know.
I guess that's
I think that's what I was like, wait, I need to read up on this afterwards. So I did, and I was like, wait, I think everyone is syncretistic.
Which makes sense because, Jesus comes into culture. He incarnates in a place. He was a Jewish man. So that, speaks to this idea that Christ is coming into a place, into a community, into a people. So, but also again, just how has that played out from Matt and Ji-gaabiikwe's perspective, and it was very interesting just how they make sense of that. And also, it seems to me a common thread I observed in what they shared is just their pursuit of trying to, again, be Indigenous and what that means, but also have a faith where they don't have to assimilate it, where it has often been a yoke that they've had to let go of, and really sounds like it's done damage to them personally, but also, I mean, we can go through the historical atrocities that have been done in the name of that. So that would probably be some of my takeaway of the conversation, but also similar to you, very challenged by just how Matt in particular can hold, in my mind, some things that I wouldn't necessarily say they're competing views on things, but just again, I haven't been around him long enough to ask enough questions, but I definitely left.
Get him back again.
just definitely left with he said something interesting about the questions that the previous generation was asking about Christianity.
Can you be Indigenous and Christian?
Are different than what he's asking, but I'm curious to unpack more of what he's asking.
Well, I think his kind of reflection on some of those things, I was just like, I think we see that true in the conversations that we're involved with. Like each generation kind of builds on the question and asks a different question. So there's some parts of me that's like, that feels really natural, that it's like, can you be Indigenous and Christian at the same time, was his father's generation's question. And so he grew up saying like, of course you can. That was the answer that he's like, I just grew up knowing that. And so his question is more, what does it mean to be fully Indigenous? And so I think I was just like, I mean, that's a natural progression. And it makes me curious about what is the long story that's unfolding. And being someone that is learning through their telling, I can only just see and listen and observe, and it's hard to fully get all of it, right? And even though I try to empathize and try to understand, like there's just some of it that I don't live that experience, and I don't live that like generations of hardship and trauma because at the hands of like colonization here in Canada. And even in Ji-gaabiikwe's story, like the 60s scoop, like that is such a marker in her story. And anyway, so I think I keep trying to remind myself, it's like, I don't need to figure it out for myself, but I need to respect that how they came to their stories was honest and true. And so their journey through it is their journey through it. And maybe a question and a challenge that I have for myself is like, what does it mean for me to be someone that will make space for someone else's journey, that wants to not just make space, but like support someone else's journey through. And and like I think you and I were just kind of even in our own debrief talking about that syncretism piece and the need to be affirmed. Like, why is it that I need someone else's story to affirm my beliefs or even parts of my story? And I think that's still is something that I feel personal challenge in, that I'm like, why do I do that? And so I'm also working through some of those things.
and also, if you're listening or watching, if you were extremely challenged by that interview, we're glad, because that was the intent. And also our heart and the whole point of this podcast and us journeying in this way is this is what it means to do the work of reconciliation.
Yeah.
It's uncomfortable. It's unfamiliar at times. It's it makes you question again your presuppositions. Mm-hmm. But I think that is not a bad thing. Mm-hmm. And to your point is this is often what it means to make space mm-hmm. for other people and other perspectives, and also just none of us have a monopoly on what God is doing.
Yeah.
We don't know what the Lord is up to always. Yeah. And so let's discern together about mm-hmm. what that looks like and what that means and how that takes different shape. Yeah. And that sounds really good. But it's hard. Like and I felt that.
Yeah.
And I still feel that.
Yeah.
Like even for me, I would say that I've spent a lot of time pursuing the ministry of reconciliation has been a big part of what I do and what I believe in and try to provide leadership, and have been on my own journey. But I was very much I realized that you never arrive.
Yeah.
There's always conversations and topics, and even just
blow it all out of the water. You're like,
and it's like that whole adage where like, the longer you live, the more you realize you don't know. Mm-hmm. And that was one of I experienced that. I appreciate that conversation.
Yeah. I sound poised and like have had time to think this through and whatever. It's because I have. But if this was recorded, right afterwards, or even at different points while I was still processing a lot of things. I mean, I had conversations with you, Matthew, where I was like, Matthew, I don't know, like I feel really uncomfortable, and I really appreciate it. Yes, you talked about being on your own journey, but I appreciate your leadership and just even saying like, you're right where you need to be. The discomfort, the not knowing the answers is like exactly where God wants you to be, because that's where you can grow. Yeah. And harken back to, I think, like one of our first after shows, I think Sam said something about like you seek discomfort. I remember that being something that Sam had said. And that's it's a challenging thing for me to seek discomfort. And I know that this is a big area of growth for me in the journey of reconciliation, is that it's just, there's not, when you hit a hurdle of discomfort, not to be like, oh no, I did it wrong, or time to quit or anything like that. But it's like, oh no, that's actually the point. That's actually a big part of the journey. And so that's been, anyway, I just want to acknowledge that I've had time to think about it and process it and kind of like work through some of that discomfort. But if that was, you asked me some of these questions the hour afterward, I've been like, I don't know. Yeah. I'm questioning everything. No, 100%.
Now. But I mean, that is a great insight and perspective into how empathy doesn't mean agreement. Mm-hmm. It means you're willing to give space to listen and to understand, mm-hmm. and to just at least wrestle for the pursuit of truth. Yeah, because that's ultimately what we're pursuing, grace and truth. And so, this is one of those conversations where it was a great growth opportunity to experience that versus just always immersing myself in conversations that I have a level of understanding, but mm-hmm. this was I was just really stretched in a good way.
Yeah. And maybe one of the things I wanted to bring up was Ji-gaabiikwe's challenge to us, like near the end, where she talked about intentionally learning and growing in the space of understanding Indigenous stories, holding space for that, and understanding the history of Canada, and allowing that to impact your perspective, our perspectives on people that we encounter, we meet, and I mean, even things that happen in our communities around us, and things that show up in the news that I read or watch, but also like it shows up in others. I remember Danny talking about Danny Zacharias in season 1, talking about, you know, there's news that Indigenous people write and kind of talk about, and are we paying attention to some of those things? So I wanted to bring that up because I think as much as, you know, we're processing, and there's some things that, you know, Matt and some things that Ji-gaabiikwe said invited, you know, challenge and asking the why questions, which is really good. But part of honoring their stories too is like, oh, actually taking some of the invitations seriously. So maybe it'd be good for us to just maybe reflect, like, you know, what does that look like for us? And then also invite others to also like, what does that look like for you in the next like year? What is something you want to learn and grow in the space of like Indigenous stories?
And we can leave some resources too. I think that would be smart to leave a couple things in the notes if people want to do some further reading or study, or just curious about what you just said about learning more. Some things that have been helpful for us in our journey, and even some resources that Deepwater has used before. We can link those in the notes to help people if you wanna take that challenge to heart and actually pursue it.
Or have something super concrete, right, to actually do. For
sure.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, Matthew, what is there something that you've been engaging on even in the last like year or 6 months or something like that to help you grow in the space of like learning about Indigenous stories?
Well, actually in my work, so I work with students of African descent within a university context, and our center that we operate shares the same space as the Indigenous Center. So the Indigenous Center is a host. So the Indigenous Center is on the bottom. The Black Center is on the top in this building. And so I interact with the Indigenous staff and students every day. And so it's a lot of it's observing, like not so much in books or in writing, but in like real time. Yeah. So some of the
and relationship proximity stuff. Yeah.
The relationship building, just observing certain practices. And this is not so much in a Christian context. This is just more culturally. Yeah. And again, things that are similar as our different, you know, tribes or people groups. But also things that are different. So one thing I've observed is we tend to be more loud. And generally speaking, they tend to be a little bit more stoic and reflective, generally speaking. Sometimes those things clash. So
I could see that.
Yeah. So even just again learning about,
you guys are on the top floor.
We're on the top. What you said? So also, you know, top of all hose, anytime you step, it's gonna make noise. But just even observing those things in real time, and how again we both learn from each other's cultures. But I've actually learned a lot just. Even how space is used within the Indigenous community. So some of my colleagues who are creating like programming in different types of space that create different, stimulate different responses, whether it's reflection or even like video games or just places for dialogue. And they do a lot of community fires and meals, and they smudge a lot of sage that I smell.
I think you said every Friday, right?
Yeah, every Friday. So I'm kind of immersed and around that all the time. So that's probably been for me more of my learning is just being and sharing. We share a home together, literally. Yeah, within our collective center. So that's
be good neighbors.
Yeah, how to be good neighbors, and I mean that's really again the heart of what Matt and Ji-gaabiikwe were saying is how do we be good neighbors to one another, and what is the role of the Indigenous community within that amongst sharing the land together as Canadians. So I kind of practice that at a very micro level every day. Yeah. How about you?
Yeah, for me, it's I don't have like proximity that I'm aware of at this point in my life, other than like some colleagues and stuff like that, but we're not in the same space together. So I really long for like more. I really learn through like relationship and intuition, like picking up things that you can't pick up through like reading. But so for now, like it is reading. I have a couple of books that I'm working through, one from Richard Twist that's been recommended by multiple Indigenous followers of the Jesus Way. And so that's been something that I've been like, just kind of like, like, oh, let me just understand it a little bit more and try to intentionally put myself in some spaces where it's like, oh, okay, that's a different way of seeing something, and that's okay. And so that's one, and it's slow. Like I have, I don't know, 5 books on the go, so it's it's a pretty slow process for me. I think the other things are, I also have that Danny Zacharias course that he has created.
Great course.
Yeah, great course. I've gone through the U of A free one. That was fantastic. I wanted to see kind of Danny Zacharias's, because he takes it from like a Christian perspective too, and so I'm just slowly working through that. Again, slow, because if it was just relationships that you just had regularly, that'd be fun and cool, and you can just kind of learn in different ways. Because I have to learn through like more I guess concrete and institutionalized ways of learning. It's a little slow for me. Gotcha. Those are some of the things that I keep trying to remind myself, like, oh, it's just a lifelong journey of learning it too. And even though it's like I don't necessarily have an ongoing relationship that I'm aware of right now, there's still things that other people made so that you can interact and you can engage. So I do remind myself, it's like, okay, at the very least, like definitely engage in some of these ways. So those are the things. So we want to leave that question for each one of you guys as you're listening into the after show. What does it look like for you to intentionally grow and learn? Specifically, how do you honor Indigenous stories? I think we're in a place where, they've invited us to honor their stories. Yeah. And so let's respond to that. Sure. And, how can we, take that seriously? Yeah.
It's good. It's a great invitation.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks for hanging with us at the same table, a Deepwater Church podcast. To learn more about who we are, where we are, resources we offer, and ways to get involved, go to deepwaterchurch.com. The Same Table podcast is produced by Matthew Thomas and Leblanc. Technical production by Sam Prime. Drop us a note if you have any questions, encouraging words, or something you'd like to learn more about at info@deepwaterchurch.com.